In this panel, our guests were asked to discuss and identify the challenges and opportunities for the inclusion of sustainable perspective in projects of infrastructure and logistics in Brazil. We would like to invite Carlos Leiria Pinto, Manager for the International Finance Corporation, Pedro Bruno Barros, Superintendent of BNDES, Karla Bertocco, Associate of Mauá Capital, and Marcelo Bomfim, President of BDMG. Our moderator will be Isadora Cohen, President of Infra Women Brazil. Ms. Isadora, you have the floor. Welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the attendance in this very prestigious panel. I'm honored to be a moderator of this cast of stars who will be sharing with us their experiences about this topic, which is one of the most discussed topics in the current days and one of the most important for the development of sustainable infrastructure. I would like, first of all, to thank ABDE for allowing me to moderate this panel, and I'm very, very honored to be here with such special guests. I'd like to thank Sergio and Bruno, on behalf of whom I would like to thank the whole organization team. This forum of development is very special, and this afternoon's panel will certainly be of the same quality. You can be sure that we are talking to people who are spearheading all of the discussions about this topic. I will read the CVs of our guests so that you can all understand how well we are off. So after reading the CVs of our guests, I'll give them the floor for them to make a brief introduction and a brief presentation about the tendencies and movements of sustainability of sustainable financing for infrastructure projects. As our MC said, we have Carlos Leiria Pinto, who is a senior management for corporate investment banking. He has experience in the private sector in many different areas. He was in different institutions and companies in working nationally and internationally. I would like to thank Carlos Leiria for his presence here. We also have Pedro Bruno Barros. He currently leads the government superintendency and institutional relationship of BNDES. He also coordinates the social environmental pipeline in the bank and is really impressive. He has 69 projects currently being structured under his leadership. It's really amazing how he can deal with all of those projects, and he is also responsible to with the interface with the federal government. In the period between 2016 and 2019, he was a part of the preparation of the plan of partnerships and investments of the Presidency of the Republic, and acted as a Secretary of Energy, Mining and Airports, and also a Secretary for Coordination of Public Policy. He has a very robust academic training. Pedro, thank you for your presence here as well. We also have with us Karla Bertocco, who is an Bertocco, who is an associate of Mauá Capital. I'm very biased to talk about Karla because I admire her so much. I had the honor of working alongside her for 10 years. She is one of the most impressive women I know. She was Subsecretary of Partnerships and Innovation in the government of São Paulo. She was the President of SAMESP, Director of BNDES. She has also been a chairwoman for the regulatory agencies of the state of São Paulo, and she's currently a consultant for Mauá Capital, with Mauá Capital, and counselor advisor of capitalization with Monsanto. She's also a leader, sectoral leader for sanitation of Infra Women Brazil. Karla, thank you very much for being here. It's an honor to have you. And last but not least, we have with us Marcelo Bomfim, the chairman of BDMG, and he was also a regional superintendent of Caixa. He has a degree in law. He has an extensive academic background, and for 33 years he worked in Bank Caixa, and with very impressive achievements. He worked for 19 years as a regional superintendent in the capital and metropolitan region in the state of Minas Gerais. He's an expert in public management, and he has signed countless funding projects, and he's also dedicated to the capacity building of public entities. I have read these impressive CVs so that you can understand that we are with the best of the best. Those who know of the topic not only in theory, but those who apply this all of those theories in practice. We'll be discussing one of the most important topics for contemporary infrastructure, which is to bring about funding and sustainable practices that should be incentivized. So based on the raising of funds, we can dedicate that to infrastructure projects in different sectors. To start, ladies first. So I'll give the floor to Karla Bertocco so that she can kick off our panel. Thank you very much for your presence. Excellent. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to congratulate my fellow speakers. Very happy to be here with you. Very happy to have Infra women here represented. So without further ado, a lot of what was asked from us before the event has to do with identifying bottlenecks suffered by institutions and international collaboration institutions, so that we can collaborate with sustainable infrastructure today. In the area I work the most, which is basic sanitation, this has been aggravated. The situation has been aggravated because of the problems that we have faced in São Paulo and all over Brazil, actually, in Bahia, in the states in the south of the country, where you have a variation. You go from water scarcity to an excess water or floods. So to think about an adequate infrastructure which can survive the impacts we're seeing, a number of new issues are being put forth. So what seems interesting to bring you is from the experience. Well, I do not belong to the financial market. I work with the infrastructure market, especially sanitation infrastructure. What we found interesting in Mauá was to put the two expertises together. When I was a client of IFC and BNDES, in several opportunities, I could see how important it is to join technical sectorial knowledge with the financial knowledge, so as to identify the gaps and the needs and come with applied solutions that would solve the pain of those sectors. So I will get this cut off from the broader scope of infrastructure. In the case of basic sanitation, particularly in function of law from July of 2020 that had a huge impact in the sanitation sector. This legislation was supported for two vectors. One has to do with the increase of the participation of the private sector. They moved from an average of 6% to 20%. And also there's a concept of regionalization, which is one of the challenges we have to overcome. But a relevant point recurrent from that is that no one does anything alone, not private companies, not public companies. We have to seek for gains in efficiency so that we can reach 100% water coverage, sewage, and an expressive reduction of loss of the water. 40% of the water produced is lost. No industry can remain standing with this type of indicator. So we have selected particularly this niche of starting to work with Mauá, which is, from the sustainability perspective, the need to reduce the losses. Official losses are 40%. We know that it's probably even higher. and we decided to focus on the supply chain. So the point I bring to complement the broader scope of sustainability is the need to look at the uh, supply chain of infrastructure sectors. And because of the unpredictability of a more perennial and stable investment dynamic, which we have had in the sanitation sector, and now having a very high demand for public and private investments in this sector, we need to prepare to be able to address it. Private companies have doubled their size. We cannot imagine that they will be able to match the needs, all of the needs, but the public companies that will remain public for a while need to count on the support of third parties to execute financing. So we have studied a lot, and we are in a partnership with development agencies, multilateral organizations, and we have created a situation in which we can precisely bring credit to the supply chains with uh, the aim of improving the supply chain, which is an Achilles heel to many industries and their sustainability pillars. We can see a huge gap of governance in the supply chain and for infrastructure providers as well. This is one of the biases we have to help with credit, also based on small and medium-sized companies that work with this side. And on the other hand, we have a perspective of objective impact, direct, measurable impact. So reduction of pollution, reduction of cubic meters of sewage, how many people in the community were directly affected and are no longer suffering from disease and pollution. So the important work is how multilateral organisms and those which support development can support indirect initiatives to improve the supply chain and infrastructure projects. We started with sanitation, having this rationale of direct impact, trying to look for measurable indicators which have to do with governance, social impacts, economic impacts. And particularly for Brazil, this vision seems very relevant because we depend a lot on SMEs. Brazil, these SMEs have a gap in access to credit. I realized in the opening of the event that we have different niches to this public because it is necessary. So in this public, we cannot offer the most traditional guarantees of the sector that are usually accepted by organizations, either corporate banks or public development banks. So an important role of this initiative is to bring forth innovative solutions that would allow us to have sufficient comfortable infrastructure so that we can have credit for many different sectors. I work more with sanitation, but I see it as an important gap so that we can address different segments. I'll stop here and pass the floor to my super qualified colleagues and to Isadora. We have more time for debates. I want to hear a lot more from you, but with these comments by Karla, I think we can start to have an international approach of what has been going on with the when the subject and the supply chain and the other chains of infrastructure reaching a federal level with Pedro, and then we can move to the state level. So I'll follow this order and call my dear friend Carlos so that he can comment what his organization has been thinking and considering sustainability, funding, and infrastructure. Thank you, Karla, for your words. Thank you, Isadora.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's a privilege to participate in this panel. I apologize for my Portuguese from Portugal, and I'm going to speak slowly so you can all understand. So I will immediately start by saying that Brazil has a huge challenge ahead, which is to close the infrastructure gap in meeting the needs of the country, both for the economy and for the population, and that at the same time how to balance this with the huge environmental and social challenges in a country that is rich in culture, biodiversity, that increases the challenges. Karla mentioned sanitation. No doubt, I have to share with you that we reviewed our strategy in Brazil in June 2020, defining as top priority of our work in Brazil water and sanitation. Because Brazil, when compared to countries with similar per capita GDP, Brazil is far behind. Its water and sanitation coverage is quite lower, and we know that there are universality targets for 2030, which is in 12 years to 11 years. So for infrastructure, that's a very short time. Of the 40, well, Karla mentioned a huge step forward that opened space, the infrastructure space for the private sector. And it is only with the private sector that we will be successful. And I have to explain something very important. The World Bank Group, as you know, has two components. One is the International Finance Corporation that finances the private sector. There's also the IBDRD, the Reconstruction and Financing International Bank for the public sector. And a few years ago, there were some questions about how to combine this. Who would finance the private, the public? Who finances water and sanitation? Is it the private or the public sector? And so, but there shouldn't be such a dichotomy, because the aim is to secure infrastructure for the population. And so our president defined a few years ago that public assets are scarce in Brazil as in other countries. And so we need to prioritize the private sector, private investment. So if we have a challenge in water and sanitation, let us knock on the doors of the private sector so that they can help us solve the problem. And only when the private sector cannot solve the problem because it's not a profitable project, because it is a social project, that's when we should resort to scarce public resources. So coming back to your question, Isadora, the challenge is how to reconcile this with the SDG challenges. I'm sorry, with the ESG challenges. And the IFC will reinforce and strengthen this mission of helping private players to address this challenge, complying with the best social environmental standards. IFC, one of the big promoters of the Ecuador agreements, established a set of performance standards covering all these areas, from natural resources to biodiversity to cultural heritage, indigenous populations. So you can easily find these standards on the website of the IFC, containing a precise description of the performance standards that are being updated monthly. Every month they are adjusted to the realities and dynamics of our times. And what IFC does is apply performance standards in three ways, in Brazil as in other places, but I will focus on Brazil. First, in all the investments we make when we work with a customer in an investment project, whether it involves debt or equity. We work with our customer to guarantee that the investment will comply strictly with these performance standards. That is one way. That sets a role model, a model that others can look up to and identify those that are doing better. Another path which is not directly related to investment is all about dissemination. It's a more altruistic action which doesn't bring about a direct benefit, but we place our resources at the disposal of Brazilian entities for training and dissemination. So we have Pedro Bruno from the BNDES. BNDES has been a major partner of ours since 2017. We are now reviewing the plan to work together so that BNDES can be a leader in this area in Portugal. Isadora drew our attention to the huge number of projects that BNDES has in its wonderful project factory, and in fact this is a very rich cooperation. And we have a consultancy area with partnerships with the private and public institutions, the private-public partnerships that have been in operation in Brazil for many years, and with a strong focus on highways, and they structured the Dutra highway, for instance, and through the structuring of PPPs, we apply the performance standards of the IFC, bringing the ESG topic into, or mainstreaming the ESG. And so in this PPP consultancy work, we also work with Caixa Econômica and with BNDES, because it's all about sharing knowledge and training and helping our local partners to build capacity so that they can become disseminators of this agenda. I'll stop here. Excellent, Carlos. I think you are becoming Brazilian. I am sure everybody could understand your Portuguese perfectly well. Excellent accent, Brazilian accent. We will now give the floor to our dear Pedro Bruno, already mentioned by everyone, and the project factory of BNDES is led by him. In addition to managing and structuring several PPPs, he also has the difficult mission of promoting green assets and getting them to be sustainable at a national level. And so, Pedro, tell us about the challenges and gaps and how the BNDES has been responding to these challenges. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. First, with such wonderful leaders here like Karla, Bruno, and also Carlos and Marcelo, and all of you here at the ABD Forum. So I will try to contribute then by pointing out that BNDES recently disclosed its strategic planning and priorities for 2022. 5 priorities. 4 are related to this panel's topic. The first is the infrastructure agenda. So Karla also has been helping build, and she mentioned sanitation sector. She is one of the biggest references in this sector, and here we are, sanitation as a major reference based on all the work that has been done by Karla in the past years. And so infrastructure, beyond the historical role of financing of infrastructure, BNDES has been investing in the project factory. in alignment with Carlos's vision that it is critical to bring in private funds in Brazil, because in Brazil we have a huge gap in infrastructure investment and we need private investment. So we have been investing a lot. We are proud to say that BNDES, we have to be careful with these figures and statistics, because we have what is considered the biggest portfolio of restructuring. We have more than 350 billion in mobilized capital for this agenda. So it is a huge effort. We've been advancing in traditional infrastructure sectors such as the highway sector, sanitation. There's a boom in the sanitation sector because of the successful cases. It's very important in the infrastructure sector to have success cases to be replicated, because this has very positive effects in attracting new partners. So we have this brand, we have the biggest portfolio. The demand for infrastructure projects in Brazil, both traditional ones such as logistics and also social environmental structure, which is a new frontier. All this demands a lot of work and many partners, and I'd like to point out here Marcelo BDMG, and we have been looking for partners within the BDE in order to carry out more projects. So there's more demand than the bank has capacity to cater for, and also creating new models. So public lighting, for instance, we created some of the first auction models, and now this is being imitated by several other structuring projects. And so as development bank, we want to encourage this, and so there's a huge agenda within infrastructure. So looking for financing and also modeling, including the best ESG criteria and practices, and we have everything it takes to become a huge strength in green economy. And we are, as Karla said, capital, national capital and international capital is very much based on ESG. So it's not just a fad. It's critical to adapt. And as developers of infrastructure, we need to adopt this as a reference. We need to mainstream this. And also the environmental agenda, Isadora. We are very proud with over 60 projects within environmental assets, construction of parks and forests. And we are going to launch the first auction for National Park of Iguaçu next month, and we expect it to be a huge success, marking the entry of the bank in this sector. For this year, it's more than ideas. We are already in the delivering, and so we are going to have more auctions, such as concession of conservation units for visitation, and also sustainable management of forests. And so for investors that are looking for economic return, there's also opportunity for reputational impact and return. Thus, we amplify the range of stakeholders and interested parties. And so some of the projects require less investment, and so it's very important to have a model that is scalable and look for replicability of standards. And so EFC is a major partner in structuring projects in the area of health,
which is the third priority put forth by ICNU. So we have educational projects and You have to create successful cases that can be replicated. So this is a major flagship in our institution as well. So we are um, getting the first health and education projects ready for this year. In the environmental agenda, I can highlight and I can mention a story which is in the magazine Valor Econômico today about the BNDES will make the first purchase of carbon credit. We understand the fourth priority, which is the decarbonizing agenda. We have a role as a country to migrate to a low carbon economy. So we have incentives in terms of the modeling of these environmental assets, which have a potential to generate credit. When we take a look at the general global background, we are probably at the position to generate the most carbon credits. Some people say that it is the oil of the future. So there we have an unexploited potential, and it's very important to say that because in most vulnerable regions of the country, like the Amazon region, we have a great potential for this agenda. So we'll make the first operation of purchasing carbon credits, and we have to push this agenda forward in the carbon market in the country. We believe that these projects we are coming up with today can be credit generating projects, and we are discussing how to combine a project that brings in thesis and environmental impact. For example, the construction of a highway. There's an investment that brings an environmental impact, but how can we communicate that and integrate it with a framework that already considers environmental offsetting, carbon neutralization, payment for environmental services, which in my perspective is a new frontier to be explored. So we end up falling in love with the relevance of this agenda, so we get carried away because of the topic. So I will stop here and thank you for the opportunity. Very good, Pedro, to hear from you. We get excited for what's to come. So moving to a more regional approach, making a very honorable mention to this bank, which is so relevant, which is BDMG, which was the first bank to launch green bonds, to also have a policy completely guided to the SDGs. This was so celebrated at the time. I would like to congratulate you first, Marcelo, and then give you the floor so that you can tell us a little bit of what the bank has been doing in this perspective that Karla has placed us for us to think as food for thought. The gaps, the challenges you managers have to deal with. Good afternoon, Isadora. Good afternoon, Pedro, a great partner of the BNDES, Karla and Carlos from IFC. It's my pleasure to be in this magnificent forum. We have some very relevant actions indeed regarding all of these content of social environmental governance and SDGs. We have been working with these concepts for 33 years. So there is this concept of having the causes of urban development and sanitation. So for 20 years working in this area, I could understand life as it is in many municipalities from Minas Gerais, small and big municipalities, especially the smaller ones that really need us. And from the 17 SDGs, we have at least 9 with a perfect connection. They are intimately connected to infrastructure. Brazil invests very little in infrastructure, only 1.5% of the GDP when we would need 4%. Despite of the awareness of we start to see and the good projects that we have, we still lack capacity of the public sector to invest, and we have a long way forward to modernize our national infrastructure. Data from the IBGE show that from every 10 people, 4 live in a situation of risk and vulnerability. They need logistics, they need infrastructure, they need ports, airports, roads, treated water, basic sanitation, basic sewage, and with that, endemic diseases, pandemics. So Brazil has a lot of dependence on road transportation. So we have advanced in terms of infrastructure of airports, but and in terms of railways, we start to point towards new directions. In terms of ports, we still have some difficulties, some issues with liberation of cargoes, and that causes a lot of losses and damage because we are coordinated without the expressive participation of other entities, and we need to improve efficiency in ports. Concessionaires of sanitation, which with no capacity of investment have little capacity to expand coverage. And we open up a spectacular possibility for the private sector to invest. So it's an opportunity to work on behalf of sanitation. So concessions, PPPs, the bank is starting to work with that. BDMG is a regional development bank, and for 60 years we have been working with that. Here in Minas Gerais, we know that many of our cities need development banks. The whole country needs development banks. Not only this country, but also partnerships with multilateral organizations with different governments and private sector. If more than 70% of people live in cities, that's where we're going to see natural disasters, sanitation problems, solid waste problems, and the development banks have a relevant role because of that, because they need to work in a hub of excellence and capacity building. Capacity building was mentioned here. It's true. Without training and capacity building, it's impossible for small municipalities to come up with good projects that would make this municipality have access to funding or resources of multilateral organizations in partnership with the banks. Today in Minas Gerais, which every year we know that the period from January to February there is a lot of rain in the state. So we do need a resilient infrastructure which adapts, which absorbs the impact, and is capable of resisting impacts, and an infrastructure that is able to recover quickly from disasters. This is only possible, in my understanding, when the municipalities will only be possible when the municipalities create mechanisms of planning, prevention, observational networks, which subsidize the monitoring of warnings, because next year everything will come back to normal probably. So we need a number of actions that will lead us to the understanding of regional realities. Brazil has great opportunities ahead. Green investment, the potential of the country is 41 trillion for climatic commitments, energy, logistics, solid waste. In the 60 years, our bank has acted with that. So with Solidarity BTMG, with the support of the government of the state of 360 million reais to infrastructure, bridges that fell, roads, and also an infrastructure to take care of the historical heritage of Ouro Preto, Mariana. Many of these cities suffered with the heavy rains, and we've lost history without support, without financial support. Churches were destroyed. So 18 months of and 9 years of payment. So we have work of concessions of road of highways starting from Mariana to Huasca with 197 kilometers of road. ESG projects, which is social environmental governance, and so we can invest in local consultancy so that specific projects for solid waste in a consortium with the municipalities can be presented with more efficiency, knowing that the methane gas, which is coming from solid waste, is a powerful gas, and in 100 years it gets stronger than carbonic gas, uh, and it needs to be acted upon. And the BDMG Bank has a very strong consultancy work with the municipalities, very strong capacity building in its staff, partnership with the IDB, European Development Bank, with the French Development Agency, with BNDES, World Bank, and many other partners. But we need to establish more partnerships. There's still time so that development banks, multilateral organisms can generate a national awareness, an international awareness. We need to not only plan but execute strategies. So these decisions are essential in our understanding. BTMG has today an online platform, and all of the credit to municipalities is distributed online. Important projects, not only to infrastructure but also for housing, work for our people. The world needs to change, and we are doing our part. We will continue to do so. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Excellent, Marcelo. Dear friends, we're moving to the second and last round of your participations. So I'd like to ask you to reply to my comment and also make your final remarks. I enjoyed thoroughly hearing you talk about the challenges and perspectives. There's a lot to come, and I'm very excited to see what's to come and see the accomplishments you will help bring to fruition. When we consider infrastructure and the tripod that sustains infrastructure, and we're talking about private investment, public investment and planning, and of course banks and financial institutions of all types. This is the tripod. And when we bring the perspective of sustainability and the social environmental governance pillar, I can see several challenges in the feasibility analysis for an infrastructure project. In the first decision-making processes, when we make the cost-benefit analysis from the perspective of the manager, and then when we decide that this investment will be conducted with a mechanism of partnership with the private sector. So adding the feasibility of the projects and the incentives that the development agencies can provide to projects that are responsible in social and environmental perspectives. What's missing? What do the managers need so that the projects are incentives to sustainable development, so that infrastructure projects can be approved more easily? What does the private initiative need to pay attention to, and what do they need as compensation for subsidized credit or favorable rates? This is just a comment, a provocative comment, so that we can discuss the mechanisms and reach a perspective of optimizing sustainability in infrastructure projects as a compensation to projects of access to credit that should also be feasible alternatives to those accessing credit in developing projects. We can start in the same order: Karla, Carlos, Pedro, and then Marcelo. So Karla and Carlos, I think we need to improve our accent so that we can match the accent from Minas Gerais, Pedro and Marcelo. Well, I'll make an effort. I'm a São Paulo woman, so help me out here if my accent is not proper. Well, thank you very much for all of the comments. It's very nice to hear all of that. So I'll make 2 points and then move to my final remarks and pass the floor to my colleagues. I think we have, first of all, a lack of clarity of how to make a given project concession or PPP or naturally sustainable.
and ESG friendly. So, I hear sanitation is ESG directly, and when you compare with oil and gas, but there are other ways of doing things, and so there's always room for details and more objective criteria. And so the concern in bringing more objectivity is not an easy discussion, but it's important. Particularly because, in general, in order to do something more sustainable, it also means that investments will be more costly. And so an intervention, you can use sustainable materials and determine that your suppliers comply with sustainable practices, and sometimes this has cost implications, and so if you have more objective criteria, it all becomes clearer, more obvious, and so the addition of any costs will be supported by the project. And so, secondly, there's a big gap where multilateral organizations and development institutions can help with, which is support and guarantees, and so, or warranties. And so many projects that I have been keeping track of recently, from the point of view of engineering and from a legal point of view, they're well designed, but in terms of funding, of fundability, right, there are, you can do better. Then if in projects that, with the FC here in São Paulo, that became very evident, but it's guarantees that sometimes are the issue, and not only for big projects, not only PPPs, but in performance contracts in the sanitation sector where this is unclear. So the relationships between parties and guarantees or warranties, and there might be room for more creative solutions, as Carlos said, and EFC has for many years leveraging other resources and those development bank resources as a way to leverage private resources and even public resources. And so guarantee solutions, warranty solutions would be my winning bet. Thank you once again for the opportunity. Thank you, Karla. Excellent provocation. I agree. There's important opportunity here, room or space that can be filled by multilateral organizations and other players of the financial sector as solid projects for investors. So, Carlos, what do you have to say about these challenges? 2 or 3 important points here in response to your question. At IFC, we believe that the industry and the market should provide solutions. Obviously, you need a legislative and regulatory framework, which little by little is being developed in Brazil. As we see in sanitation, there are essential transformations. But after that, it's the market that has to work. And I would say that it depends a lot on the financial sector. It's the banks that have to mainstream ESG for many reasons. Because in determining the capital necessary to cover the risks of the credit portfolio, well, until now, this was not being considered adequately. Social environmental risks were not appropriately considered. So the central bank is bringing this to the table, and little by little, the financial system in Brazil is mainstreaming in its risk analysis, as it should, for all projects that are being financed. And there is some resistance. People think, it's going to complicate the process. No, it won't. It will help, and it will minimize, ultimately, capital needs, because the risk is better calculated, and so there will be less requirements of own capital. That's a win-win situation, and so IFC has a memorandum of understanding with FEBRABAN to help all FEBRABAN members to improve their social environmental standards and performance standards, and help them understand what climate financing is, financing projects with climate-related financial products. And so I would like to mention markets such as the Asian. Paradoxically, China is leading this, but also in Europe, those who finance green finance more cheaply. Cost of funding in financial markets or capital markets through green loans or through green bonds, well, it will always be cheaper. It's not yet in Brazil, but Brazil is opening a path. The market is still small, but the potential is huge. So when this market consolidates itself, those who are issuing debts for infrastructure projects, if they follow the green path, the funding costs will be cheaper, and this is the best incentive that they can have. Perhaps a concrete case in infrastructure is construction. Most of the GHG emissions, well, construction works are major contributors to this negative contribution to climate change. And so today we talk about green buildings, sustainable buildings. This is something that banks and countries, in Brazil as a highly urbanized country, perhaps the most urban country of Latin America, has an advantage in taking the path towards green building. Now, what's the beautiful story behind this? Remember what we did in Colombia with the biggest private bank of Colombia. The Colombia Bank decided to work with IFC in green credits, and so offices, shopping centers, hotels, even social housing. The Bank of Colombia created a fast-track mechanism for those engaged in these projects with a green certification, with a reduced spread. And so this was a positive incentive, saying if you bring this shopping center project with a green certification or a certification by the IFC, we will give you more competitive spread than if you bring us a project that is not sustainable. So this is just one more example to illustrate how it is possible through the private sector, without any type of additional links, to promote green infrastructure here in Brazil. Thank you, Isabel. Excellent, Carlos. Such a pertinent comment. Bruno knows that I wrote an article saying that ESG is not yet mainstreamed in Brazil. And what you're saying, Carlos, is so interesting. Brazil has many initiatives, but we haven't yet arrived at the point when criteria to enable a sustainable green project, they still don't generate a subsidized rate or a benefit for the issuer. So thank you, and I love that you mentioned sustainability for private sector to develop itself based on a public initiative project. So in partnership. Bruno, we're anxious to hear you. We have only a couple of minutes. I didn't want to rush you, but I have this difficult task of keeping track of time. I apologize. Yes, Isadora, I'll be brief. I just want to speak about what we have here at BNDES. This provocation, I agree that we need to bring this to everything. So if we are rediscussing all the areas of action of the bank based on the sustainability agenda, some concrete examples regarding credit. Our ASG credit last year, it's a Lincoln loan that provides more attractive conditions for customers to commit to improving indicators and adopting sustainable practices. And so this is already implemented by the bank. And I mentioned the climate fund. We are managers of the climate fund, which is credit that in order to invest in the environmental agenda, also providing special conditions. It's like the bread and butter of credit, and we need to advance more. But as I mentioned, this effort of bringing in private capital for concessions of parks and forests, one of the challenges, it's the challenge of a non-existent market. We need to create the market and get new players to get in this market. And so we made guarantees and credit lines more flexible so that concessionaires of parks and forests can access the bank. And so this was last year. Last year we started incentivizing from a credit point of view all these projects. That's on the credit side. Now on the side of structuring, we've been seeking to materialize the ESG criteria. And so an example of an iconic asset for the Port of Santos. So in the modeling of the Port of Santos, there are aspects related to governance and climate change, mitigation of climate change, efficiency of natural resources, conservation of biodiversity. So there are a range of elements included in the modeling. And it's very interesting because this involves fundability, but also the IFC and the World Bank are sources and references because they apply all these best practices, and so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but rather bring this in and adapt to our reality. Excellent. Pedro, who is heading the project factory, you know how important this is from the beginning, to have well-defined criteria from the start of projects to get them to influence sustainable practices. Marcelo, your final thoughts on the challenges of implementing in practice sustainability indicators in projects and at the same time getting banks to play a more active role in this agenda. I'll be brief. First, I have to agree fully with my predecessors, especially when Carlos says that banks need to buy into ESG. The BDMG is committed in its strategic planning, in all its actions, with the SDG agenda. And so for each project, where do the SDGs fit? Third, fantastic experience we have with IDB. Through consultancy, we were trained by IDB in tools that calculate whether the project or company or the GHG emissions in the project, and when this is less, the company will receive a more attractive rate and facilitating work for future generations.
One of the aspects of the bank and practical work is to follow municipalities in time. In the past, the guaranteeing fund was the only vector for the framework of sanitation. Today, the market contains a lot more participation of the private sector, which will modernize sanitation with a new model in the country. And I believe that with the law of tax responsibility, in the last years, the municipalities have had capacity of payment. With the increase of payment capacity in the municipalities, they can present good projects. Lastly, the TMG Bank wants to be an excellence hub to qualify municipalities and projects so that they can get resources and consultancy which is needed for these projects. Small cities have no consultancy, they don't know how to design projects. That's an unfortunate fact. So only development banks can work to help municipalities that much. That was basically it. Thank you very much for the invitation. Excellent, Marcelo. All of the speakers were excellent. I've learned a lot in this session. I believe we managed to raise several important points, starting with the supply chain and this need that if we adhere to sustainable patterns, we can possibly see and deal with the increase of prices and be prepared for it, prepared for providing answers to that. We've learned about how to create projects so that the private initiative can be a protagonist in this development without depending on tools that would balance a public participation. Even though the initiative is public, but private initiative can be main actors of that, main players of that. We are also talking about creating new markets that are aware of sustainable development and pay attention to sustainable development and infrastructure. And we also talked about the need to see the realities, face the realities of municipalities, and to address social environmental SEGs. And I believe that there is a huge possibility of participation in development agencies as important guaranteeing funds of these projects. So many other aspects that were very light and educational, and the ESG parameters and the social environmental responsibility should be incorporated in our infrastructure projects. And at some point in Brazil, as Karla said, we will manage to have financial incentives from the capital market and from the financial capital market, so that we can access cheaper credit and access more robust guarantees, so that we can launch infrastructure projects in partnership with private initiative and the public sector in order to change infrastructure in Brazil, which is quite urgent and very dear to all of us. Karla, Carlos, Pedro, and Marcelo, it was an immense pleasure to talk to you in this panel. I've learned a lot. You are stars of this show, and thank you very much to ABD for the opportunity. And let's move on with the events agenda. Thank you and congratulations. Thank you. We are the ones who thank you for this very instructional panel on the ABD Development Forum.